Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. When the music industry loses some of its most iconic and influential figures, a huge swath of mourning is released amongst those who enjoyed their work. Elvis Presley, Freddie Mercury, Michael Jackson, the list is endless. Musicians whose songs connected with millions on a deep level. But there are a number of tragedies that befell members of the music industry that barely get a mention. And today, I wanted to focus on two men whom, after finding success towards the end of the 1980s, would have their meteoric rise stopped firmly in its tracks. This is the story of the London Boys. The story of our love. Our focus today settles on these two gentlemen, Edom Ephraim and Dennis Fuller, born 2 weeks apart from each other in 1959, the former in London and the latter in Jamaica. During their school years in Greenwich, the two met and quickly became best friends by the age of 11. The two enjoyed exercising, performing and dancing, passions for which would form their basis of their act later down the line. As they reached their 20s, the pair decided to join a group that fully embraced one of the biggest trends of the late 70s, roller skates. The Roxy Roller outfit were a group who would sing and dance, all while darting about on their wheeled footwear. Dennis and Edom were a natural fit, given their prowess at dancing, and even featured on the group's only single, I Need a Holiday, which sadly didn't chart anywhere. However, the 80s were looming, and they would provide countless opportunities for a whole bunch of aspiring music acts. If the late 70s was the era of disco, then the early 80s would be characterised by the new wave scene, and its heavy use of synthesizers. Acts such as Germany's own Kraftwerk were instrumental in pioneering these electronic-based tunes, which were breaking into the mainstream charts more and more frequently. Speaking of Germany, Dennis and Edom would relocate to the German city of Hamburg in 1981. For the next few years, they would dance and perform at several clubs throughout the city, hoping that the right person would be in the audience in order for them to have a true crack at mainstream success. After 5 years of hard graft, in 1986, that moment would arrive. For those who are fans of the Beatles, you may recognise the importance of Hamburg as a springboard city of sorts for aspiring artists, for it was Hamburg where the Beatles, pre-mainstream success, would constantly perform. The man behind their booking was Horst Fascher. Maintaining his eye for talent in the following decades, whilst visiting the Black Market nightclub, Fascher witnessed the two lads from London showcase their stuff on the main stage. Dazzled by their ability to sing, dance, and just their sheer charisma, Fascher would introduce the pair to Chappell Music Publishing. Impressed by the boys, Chappell was a bit stumped as to what to do with them, in terms of how to package and promote the act. To resolve this, they brought in Ralph Rene Maui, a writer and producer who had contributed songs to Chappell in the past. For Maui, this was a dream come true. He instantly began working on songs that would benefit the boys' talents. Tracks with great lyrics to belt out, but also melodies in which they could demonstrate just how appealing their dancing could be. All of this culminated in the summer of 1986, for which the duo, now newly christened as the London Boys, would release their very first single, I'm Gonna Give My Heart. Right from the opening notes, this would be the style in which the London Boys would continue to hone and adapt their signature sound. A dramatic production, matched by the instrumentation which honestly remains one of my favourites of their discography. However, despite finally having a single under their own banner, success wouldn't arrive right out of the gate. At least, that was the case when it came to the European markets, including their native UK. However, I'm Gonna Give My Heart was insanely successful in South Korea, where it would top the charts. Aiming to keep any sort of momentum going, Ralph Rene Maui worked on follow-up singles for the London Boys to release, including Harlem Desire, My Love, and Dance Dance Dance. Those first two would also reach number 1 in South Korea, giving the duo 3 chart toppers in that region and cementing them as one of the most well-known and popular acts of the late 80s. Such was their popularity that My Love would hit number 1 in South Korea a second time, just as the country's capital, Seoul, was gearing up to host the 1988 Olympic Games. Around that same time, the partnership of Dennis, Edom and Ralph Renee were making preparations of their own to finally release the London Boys' first studio album, to be titled The 12 Commandments of Dance. When the LP dropped in 1988, it naturally picked up steam quickly in the boys' most popular market, South Korea, where it eventually went quadruple platinum. Not too shabby for your first record. However, despite a steadily growing popularity, the pair were largely going unnoticed in Europe. Their main sights were set on the UK, which outside of the US was perhaps the biggest and most influential music market of the time. The barrier for them was surprisingly their UK label, WEA, which was part of the Warner Music Group. According to the article on Ralph Renee's website, WEA strictly refused to release any London Boys records in the UK. He writes, "You have to know that WEA had always been a bit of a posh label. They looked after artists such as Prince, Madonna, etc., and nobody in the company wanted to be seen dead with such inferior pop music from the continent, although it was already on heavy rotation in the gay clubs via imports." However, just as Dennis and Edom had Horst Fascher break down barriers for them to get signed, their breakthrough in the UK was largely helped by one man who at the time was seen as one of the most influential and powerful people in British pop music, Pete Waterman.
Believe it or not. Well, it's all lies.
Pete Waterman was a producer and songwriter, one part of the powerhouse trio known as Stock, Atkin and Waterman, or SAW for short. Throughout the latter half of the 1980s, SAW was responsible for a whole wealth of hit singles, giving many artists their breakthrough, including Jason Donovan, Kylie Minogue, and even by 1988, their dominance in pop was assured, and it was generally thought that if you worked with them, you'd have a hit single on your hands for sure. Pete Waterman had in fact discovered the London Boys album whilst visiting Paris, and fell in love with the sound and stylings of the duo. Despite being unavailable to purchase in the UK, according to Ralph Renee, Waterman would hold up the album on his late-night television programme, The Hitman and Her, and speak on how fantastic it was. After much pressure from Waterman, WEA finally relented and agreed that they would release the album in the UK, with new song Requiem as the lead single. This was a true make-or-break moment. If Requiem didn't capture the ears of the British public, then the London Boys' chances of chart success in the region would grow ever slimmer. When it came to making the track, Ralph Renee saw this as a culmination of the huge, dramatic soundscape he wanted to create for the London Boys. With larger-than-life sounding production, a rap-based verse, and a tantalising chorus, this was everything a lead single could have hoped to be in 1988.
You're the love of my life, my life, my life, and I won't let you go now.
But when it came to pass, how did the single perform? After finally being released in the UK by WEA, Requiem entered the charts at number 61 in the December of 1988. It would remain on the charts for 9 weeks, never peaking higher than 59th and reaching lows of 94th, which would be its last chart placement before bowing out in February of 1989. But how did this happen? The track was a solid pop banger, it had the backing from one of the most successful pop producers of all time. Why didn't it climb higher? According to Ralph Renee Maui, a lack of promotional support from WEA was the main reason for the single stalling in the charts. However, appalled by this result, Pete Waterman went back to WEA and turned his tactics up a notch. Despite the prospect being a legal nightmare, Waterman allegedly threatened WEA that if they didn't promote the London Boys appropriately, he would release their material on his own record label, PWL, the stable house from which all SAW artists had their records released. Accepting his bombastic bluff, WEA would re-release Requiem with stronger promotion, including appearances from the boys on TV programs such as Top of the Pops, as well as the aforementioned Hitman and Her. The song re-entered the charts at number 55 in the April of 1989, instantly beating its previous peak, and by May, it had entered the top 10, peaking for 3 weeks at the number 4 position. So Dennis and Edom had finally done it. After nearly a decade of dancing in clubs, working on their act, perfecting their image, and slaving away at a slew of strong singles, they now finally had a hit at home. And for the remainder of 1989, the hits just kept on coming. As with any pop act, you can't just rest on the laurels of your first hit single, lest you be confined to the often maligned status of one-hit wonder. Thankfully, the London Boys had the perfect follow-up ready to go, the equally epic-sounding London Nights. Releasing in July of 1989, the new track entered the charts within the top 20, at number 19. The following week saw it rise to number 3, and by the end of the month, London Nights peaked at number 2, giving the London Boys their highest charting single yet.
last forever. And don't make me cry.
Several performances on TV undoubtedly helped boost the single's presence, not only proving Dennis and Edom to be some of the most talented dancers amongst their contemporaries, but also how that blended with their sound. As Alan Connor writes in 2021, the London Boys' sound was established as huge melodic productions, packed with oceans of vocals and instruments. This sound very much fits in with the pop standard of 1989, with several soul productions continuing to dominate the charts, many of those singles also containing multiple layers of production. After two top 5 singles, their first studio album, The 12 Commandments of Dance, finally saw an official UK release in the summer of 1989. It debuted at number 2, and would remain a fixture on the album's chart for 29 weeks, lasting until February of 1990. There's a lot of great tracks to be heard on The 12 Commandments of Dance, including the MIDI Dance, Wichita Woman, their first ever single, I'm Gonna Give My Heart, and the surprisingly dark Chinese Radio. Described by Ralph Renee in a 2021 interview, a guy in the Far East takes too many drugs and wakes up lying on a bed in his hotel room. But every time he's regaining consciousness, all he sees is a little Chinese transistor radio playing by his bed. The song remains one of the standout tracks of the album, and despite seeing its potential as a single, Maui admits, not for the London Boys in 1989. The next single, in fact, was already being crafted by Maui, a new song entitled Chapel of Love. However, WA instructed Ralph Renee to hold off, as in his own words, the label wished to milk the album first. As such, the next single would be Harlem Desire, slightly reworked from its original 1987 release. It performed admirably, peaking at number 17 in the September of 1989. And like its two predecessors, Harlem Desire combined elaborate, dramatic production with slick vocals and a meticulously crafted dance routine showcased on all of the major music programs on TV. However, Ralph Renee observed the single's failure to reach the top 10, and in 2021 claimed that due to WEA's insistence on milking the album, that he knew there and then the act was dead, because now we had to put out old songs from 87, 88 as singles to follow up from the innovative Requiem and London Nights. Harlem Desire was indeed a 2-year-old song upon its UK release, and the same could be said for the fourth and final single from 12 Commandments, My Love. As mentioned, this song had been one of several chart toppers for the London Boys in South Korea, but again, it had first seen that success back in 1987. And despite seeing a remix from some of the top producers of PWL, the single stalled and peaked at number 46 in December 1989, disappearing from the charts entirely by the beginning of 1990. Not even an appearance on TV-AM promoting the importance of fitness could help save it. And yes, that was a real thing, complete with gaudy sweaters. Regardless of My Love's disappointing chart placement, 1989 had been a monumental year for the London Boys. They'd broken into the UK music scene, scored 2 top 5 hits, and an album that went on to be certified platinum. In a rather ironic twist, the London Boys became WEA's best-selling act of 1989, a triumph considering the label's initial hesitancy and resistance to even release the lads' records in the UK at all. But as the 1990s began to loom, massive changes to the music industry would occur, just as they had done at the beginning of the 80s. And for the London Boys, now established as a successful pop act, could they weather the storm that was to come? Going into 1990, it's fair to say that the London Boys' oldest and most loyal collaborator, Ralph Renee Maui, believed, whether publicly or privately, that the duo's moment in the sun had already passed. By 1990, music had changed, and that great jolly sound we had wasn't working anymore. Having wanted to release the aforementioned Chapel of Love back in 1989, the song finally hit record shops as the lead single to the duo's second studio album, Sweet Soul Music. It continued to develop the Requiem-style sound, with dramatic production and such, but as Ralph Renee notes in 2021, Chapel of Love just sounded dated, a year after the Requiem formula, even though it was one of the best songs I've ever written. Maui's predictions also came to manifest in the UK singles chart, with Chapel of Love debuting and peaking at number 75, dropping out of the charts completely 3 weeks later, in the June of 1990. Undeterred, a second single, Freedom, would follow some months later, performing much more strongly, but only managing to peak at number 54, in the January of 1991. When the second album, Sweet Soul Music, did eventually drop in the UK the same year, it didn't even manage to make the albums chart. This must have been a crushing blow to Edom and Dennis, who just 2 years prior had one of the biggest selling LPs in the country. Ralph Renee exemplifies that disappointment by saying, "It's insane, after an album that nearly went double platinum, that Sweet Soul Music didn't chart." 3 more singles attempted to regain some of the ground the London Boys had so desperately tried to build, including the Motown-infused title track Sweet Soul Music, the more balladesque Is This Love, and the upbeat Tonight Tonight, none of which were able to even make the UK singles chart.
Happy New Year 1993, a very warm welcome from Carlton TV.
In just the space of 2 short years, pop music had changed entirely. The 90s actually brought in a major threat to the more traditional, family-friendly sound of pop, with genres such as grunge and gangster rap exploding in popularity, with pop subsequently adapting a harder, edgier sound. More jolly-sounding tracks still hit the top 10 every now and then, but for the most part, acts like the London Boys, whose signature sound was bathed in lavish production and instruments of the 80s, was now already seen as wildly dated and profoundly uncool amongst music fans. The failure of Sweet Soul Music could have marked a really easy point for the London Boys to pack it all in, but just as they had done during their rise in the 80s, they pressed forward. By 1993, Eurodance had risen to become one of the biggest genres in popular music. With little focus on lyrics and more on the thumping beats, these tracks were rather like Marmite. You either love them, or you hate them. The needle was pointing more towards the former in the early 90s, with tracks such as the mega smash Rhythm is a Dancer cementing the sound into popular culture. Sensing this shift, Ralph Renee, together with Dennis and Edom, crafted a new album that embraced these current trends in dance music, resulting in their 3rd studio LP, Love for Unity. The lead single actually had dropped the year prior in 1992, the dance-heavy Moonraker. And no, it has nothing to do with the 1979 James Bond film or the Shirley Bassey title track of the same name, though it is an absolute banger, fully in line with its contemporaries of the genre. If anything, it not only continued the London Boys' penchant for big dramatic sounds, but also developed it into more of that 90s style, reminiscent of the Eurodance scene. Moonraker, however, did fail to chart, but all were hopeful that the second single would be the great return of the London Boys to mainstream popularity. The single in question was a cover version of the Equals' 1966 song, Baby Come Back, now given a 90s makeover.
Come back, baby, come back.
When asked in 2021 about why a cover of a near 30-year-old song was the way to go for Love for Unity's promotion, Ralph Renee Maui said, "The cover version was a way of trying to get some attention, because they were the in thing at the time. And if you look at the pop landscape of 1992-93, he certainly isn't wrong." One hit cover that springs to mind was Erasure's ABBA-esque EP, taking tracks from the iconic Swedes and giving them a fresh 90s sound. It duly raced to number 1, so you can forgive the London Boys for thinking that taking a 60s hit and giving it their signature spin would at least see it crack the top 40, right? Sadly, Baby Come Back would be another entry in the long list of London Boys singles that failed to make the UK singles chart. Perhaps crueler still, just over 1 year later, in the autumn of 1994, Peyto Banton, together with Ali and Robin Campbell of UB40 fame, released their own cover of Baby Come Back, which would go on to reach number 1 in the UK, staying there for 4 weeks. With their revamped cover and new sound failing to catch on, when Love for Unity was eventually released in 1993, it made the weakest splash of any London Boys LP thus far. It didn't chart anywhere, and their label at the time, East West, was recommending to Dennis and Edom that they sack off their longtime friend and producer, Ralph Renee Maui, in favour of a new team who would try and take them in a new, more successful direction. Ever the gentleman, the two declined the offer, instead heading to Polydor with Maui, with a rather interesting concept. Having always been inspired by the dramatics of the church, such as gospel, Ralph Renee alongside Dennis and Edom presented to Polydor an idea for an album that combined gospel songs but to a dance beat. Given that at the time most popular dance tracks were of a high BPM and practically anything was being mashed together with a dance beat, why not attempt it with gospel? The result was 1995's Hallelujah Hits, under the banner of The New London Boys. Now, despite being an atheist myself, I do love a good dance beat, and this album surprisingly has several strong cuts. These include the singles, including Gospel Train to London, which had an internationally based music video, and the follow-up, Kumbaya.
He's got the whole world in his hand. He's got the whole wide world in his hand. He's got the whole wide world in his hand. He's got the whole world in his hand.
From what I can gather, Hallelujah Hits was only released in certain European territories. It didn't manage to chart or reinvigorate the London Boys as a pop brand, but the two were clearly enjoying this new direction, and plans were already being drafted up with Ralph Renee for more songs embracing the church theme. However, despite this new lease of creative life, the time of the London Boys was about to be cut dramatically short, in a terrible fashion. Ever since he'd come to know them, Ralph Renee had always held an opposition to Dennis and Edom heading off on their skiing trips to the Eastern Alps. A favourite downtime activity held by the pair, Maui always tried to talk them out of it, claiming that if they gained an injury, then they'd be in a jam in regards to performing. Nevertheless, year after year, the boys would continue to head off on their ski trips. But in 1996, Ralph Renee's worst fears came true, but beyond anything he could have ever imagined. On the 21st of January, 1996, Dennis and Edom were in the process of enjoying their latest excursion through the Austrian Alps. On the opposite side of the road, a drunk driver was heading towards them at speed, and eventually would crash into them head-on. The collision caused 5 deaths: the drunk driver, who hailed from Switzerland, a Hamburg DJ, who was a mutual friend of the London Boys, Edom's wife, Bettina, as well as Dennis and Edom themselves. All that talent, all that passion, and all that love wiped out at the tender age of 36. After what was meant to be a fresh start for the new London Boys, this accident would bring that legacy to an unfortunate end. Their closest friend and colleague, Ralph Renee Maui, was awoken early in the morning by a call from the biggest German newspaper around, asking for comment about the death of the London Boys. Maui recalls that, "I was completely numb. The best friends I ever had." It's been over 25 years since the London Boys tragically had their lives cut short, and yet their music lives on amongst fans old and new. Despite breaking relatively late in the overproduced pop-dominated landscape of the 80s, songs like Requiem and London Nights were able to assert their status quickly and efficiently, and several of their album tracks, such as Chinese Radio and Moonraker, stand out all on their own, even if they are very much products of their time. If you wish to immerse yourself in the London Boys' back catalogue, I highly recommend this box set, Requiem, The London Boys Story. This 5-disc release contains their first 3 albums, some of them being fully accessible on CD again, as well as 2 bonus discs containing remixes from across their career. You can get a physical release from Cherry Red Records, or download it off of iTunes. And before we close off today, we're going to take a minute to acknowledge the major players in the London Boys story. Horst Fascher is a more influential figure in this tale than you may think. Without him seeing the boys perform in Hamburg, they would have never been introduced to Chappell Music Publishing, and subsequently, Ralph Renee Maui. He continues to reside in Germany today, currently at the age of 86. Pete Waterman would continue to help churn out hit after hit with Mike Stock and Matt Atkin, though by the early 90s, their winning streak had eroded, with the changing tides of the pop industry pushing them aside, in a similar vein to the London Boys. However, his legacy as part of SAW is vastly celebrated in the modern day, with several high-profile artists having once been a part of their banner. Without Pete's continuous pressure on the WEA record label, we may have never seen a single London Boys record have a UK release. Thus he remains an essential part of the London Boys story. Waterman still survives today, and is currently 75 years old. Ralph Renee Maui is often referred to as the third London Boy, and it's abundantly clear to see why. He was the first person to not only appreciate Dennis and Edom's talents, but know how to utilise them, in order to present the perfect pop package. His abilities as a songwriter allowed him to craft pop songs that were successful in the mainstream, whilst also generating cuts that were off the beaten path, helping to distinguish the London Boys amongst their pop contemporaries. Despite his premonitions that the act was doomed commercially as early as 1990, he stuck by the duo, all the way up until their deaths in 1996. In turn, they didn't abandon him, even when their label was encouraging them to get rid of him. He wasn't just their songwriter or their producer, he was their friend. And in his eyes, they were his best friends. Ralph Renee has continued to work for a variety of artists throughout his career, and a good chunk of the information I found for this video comes from his own personal website, as well as an interview he gave for the Requiem box set. Dennis and Edom may have been the frontmen, but without Ralph Renee, the London Boys wouldn't have been what they were. Finally, we touch on the two lads themselves. Dennis Fuller and Edom Ephraim. For two boys who grew up with a love of dancing and performing, for them to do what they did in their lifetime is such a special achievement. Many will today still just dismiss them as a cheesy pop act, but you can't brush aside the sheer talent these two possessed. Those slick dance routines and vocals don't just appear overnight. It takes time, hard work, something that these two grew familiar with quickly. After spending years working the Hamburg club circuit, their patience was rewarded, and although it took a few more years to find success in their native UK, once they found it in spades. 1989 was the year of the London Boys, with their presence on TV, and more importantly on the charts, cementing them as one of the most standout and successful breakthrough acts of the year. Bittersweet, I suppose, given how quickly that success evaporated as the ever-changing landscape of pop music shifted drastically at the dawn of the 90s. But despite their style of pop going out of fashion, they never once relented or just gave up. Instead, they embraced new trends, experimented with different sounds and genres, from Motown soul to reggae. And had their lives not been cut so short, I reckon their new church-inspired direction would have provided them with a joy that transcends commercial success. But whether or not that would have come to pass, we'll never know. Both London Boys left children behind in the wake of their death. Dennis's daughter Laura was 10, who was now being raised solely by her mother. But for Edom's son, Stevie, who was only 3, he was now left without both parents, as Edom's wife also perished in the accident. Tragic occurrences such as these remind us of the fragility and importance of life, to live every day to the full and to pursue our dreams and ambitions regardless of any sort of financial reward they may encompass. For that reason, I'll always have a great respect for the legacy of the London Boys. Not only did they craft out some great pop in their short time in the spotlight, but they represent the result that hard work, determination, and sheer passion can achieve. And so, we remember them. Dennis Fuller and Edom Ephraim, two boys from London who went on to inspire, to entertain, and to spread their love of music and dance to audiences across the world. This is our remembrance, our requiem for the London Boys.